3 kittens, freezing in a trash bin, were on the brink of death. The cold pierced them to the bone, and the silence around them seemed endless. In that moment of utter despair, when hope was gone, a cry rang out, their last chance at survival. Someone heard it. Someone came. What happened next changed everything. Night fell, and the cold immediately crept into every corner of the city, like a dark, invisible creature, swallowing all that was alive. The wind howled through the empty streets, lashing rain and snow against the broken walls and piles of trash. The sky was deafeningly heavy, like a blanket that offered no light. In this dark, icy world, abandoned and cast aside by people, 3 tiny kittens lay amidst the cold refuse. Their bodies were small, barely visible against the debris, the stench of rot and decay filling the air. Their fur, wet and matted with dirt, clung to their bony frames. Every cell of their tiny beings felt the unbearable cold, as though all life in the world had suddenly frozen, leaving them here, on this forgotten dump, to disappear into the shadow of the winter night. The kittens didn't know they had become orphans. All they remembered was the warmth of their mother, her soft paws, her gentle eyes. But now, she was gone. Gone were her protective embraces, her comforting sounds. They woke, pressing against one another, trying to stay warm. But the warmth had vanished, just like everything that had once seemed familiar. The cold wind blew away the last fragments of hope that had been left in their tiny, helpless hearts. The orange kitten, the bravest of the 3, opened his eyes, filled with pain and exhaustion. He crawled forward, almost losing his balance, trying to reach a trash bag where there might be some food. He stretched toward it, his paws slipping on the wet pavement, and every step felt like agony. He didn't understand that his body was failing, that his stomach ached from hunger, and each breath he took felt like it could be his last. But he couldn't stop. He knew one thing. He had to move. He had to survive. His little chest heaved and his paws, weak, struggled to cover the distance. He felt his body covered in cold sweat, and every cell in him trembled from the pain and fear. He stopped for a moment, his eyes staring into the darkness, hearing only the rain's roar and the wind's howling, piercing everything around him. But it was unbearably quiet. A heavy silence, oppressive, as if something great and irreversible was about to happen this night. His sister, gray and tiny, shivered from the cold, lying motionless among the trash, while his brother, with white patches on his paws, remained still. He was so emaciated that he could barely keep his eyes open. The orange kitten crawled to her, touching her cold, stiff body with his nose in search of some warmth, but instead he felt only the frost that numbed his little paws. She was still alive, but her strength was gone. There was no hope in her eyes, only helplessness. She couldn't get up, couldn't help herself or her brother. She was too weak. The kitten pulled away from her, his paws slipping on the wet ground, and he shuddered again. He knew that in this world, no one would come to help, no one would hear their cries. He knew that it was unlikely anyone would survive this night. Their entire life had been a struggle, and they were on the verge of losing it. The sounds of the city, so familiar yet unbearably foreign, reached his ears. The soft steps of someone who perhaps passed by, unaware of them. Past these 3 little lives, hiding from the world in the trash and filth, unnoticed, like shadows. No one paid attention. It was already too late. They had already been forgotten. He felt his heart beat faster. Fear gripped him, but in his eyes, despite everything happening around him, there remained a flicker of hope, a tiny, barely noticeable spark. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring for him and his sisters. He didn't know if they would survive this night. But one thing was clear. Despite the pain and despair, despite the cold, they were still fighting, still trying to hold on, no matter how much the world abandoned them. And perhaps that little spark of hope could still catch fire someday if they survived. But for now, there was only one thing: darkness, cold, and the loneliness that absorbed everything around them. The darkness remained impenetrable, like a thick veil, stifling every movement. The wind relentlessly battered the tiny bodies of the kittens, seeping through their wet fur and chilling them to the bone. Time stretched endlessly, and the little hearts beat weaker and weaker, each pulse losing a fragment of hope. The small orange kitten, the one who seemed the strongest of the three, continued his fight. He knew there was no other choice. If he stopped, if he ceased moving, if his little body gave up, he would simply disappear, just like his mother. He couldn't allow that. He couldn't let himself die here, in this forgotten part of the city, amidst the trash and filth. His tiny paws struggled to move across the slippery pavement, his lungs barely keeping up with the heavy breathing. Every movement was painful. Each step felt like it could be his last. With each turn of his head, he felt his muscles tighten with exhaustion, and his vision became more and more blurred. But he kept crawling. He couldn't stop. Deep in his eyes burned a faint spark, a tiny spark of hope. He reached the trash bin and nudged it with his paw. The bin was huge, but its bottom was empty, almost hopelessly filthy. There was no food inside, only scraps that could hardly fill their hunger. But atop it lay a piece of soft cloth. The kitten struggled up onto it and curled up beside it. He knew it wouldn't help, that he would still be hungry, but at least it offered some semblance of protection. His gaze never left his two siblings. They lay motionless, quietly, as if there were no life left in them. The gray kitten pressed against the trash, her eyes closed, her breathing barely audible. The white kitten still hadn't moved. He was too weak to continue the fight. The orange kitten felt his heart tighten with pain. He knew that every moment could be the last for his siblings. But what could he do? He was alone. Completely alone. He wanted to call to them, to try and lift them onto their paws, but only a faint, strangled sound escaped his chest, barely audible in the stillness of the night. The wind carried his cry away, offering him no chance of being heard. The kitten looked back at his sisters. He didn't know what to do, how to help them. All he could do was remain silent and hope. Then something strange happened. He felt a slight movement on his paw. It was so unexpected that the kitten froze, unable to believe it could be real. He lifted his head and saw his sister, the gray kitten, beginning to stir. A soft sound, like a moan, escaped her lips. It wasn't a struggle. It was like a painful rebirth, a small step toward life. The orange kitten rushed to her, his heart pounding faster. He touched her paw, and she responded with a weak movement. His eyes filled with tears. He felt that maybe, just maybe, she would survive. Maybe it wasn't all lost. But in that moment, he felt a terrible cold tightening around his body, his paws beginning to tremble from exhaustion. He struggled to rise to his feet and gently stroked her back, trying not to lose hope. But all of this was only temporary relief. The kittens were still alone in this world full of shadows and cold, and despite the faint signs of life, they were still in danger. The sound of a car, a sharp, piercing noise, suddenly shattered the night's silence. The kitten clenched his paws, his body turning to stone. He held his breath, pressing himself against the trash bin. The car passed by, oblivious to them, but it felt like a lightning strike to his nervous system. In that moment, he felt that every movement, every glance, could be his last. There was no place for pity in his world. In his world, there was only survival. Strength was leaving him, but the little spark in his heart still burned. It was small, but it was there. And in that moment, in the darkest depths of the night, when it seemed nothing could change their fate, the orange kitten believed, maybe, just maybe, all was not lost. The night was so cold that it seemed everything living in the universe had slowed its movement, absorbed by the relentless chill. The wind whistled through the alleyways, like the spirits of the dead, and the air was thick with a suffocating silence, as if the earth itself was waiting for something dreadful, inevitable. The trash bin, which had become their temporary refuge, seemed endlessly empty, as if everything inside it had vanished into the darkness. The orange kitten, still lying on the worn rag, could no longer suppress his shivering. His tiny body was engulfed by cold helplessness, and his eyes were half closed from exhaustion. He didn't know how long it had been since he last held back his tears. How many hours he had already fought against this hopelessness. His paws slid over the cold trash, and he tried to move, searching for any warmth, any form of protection. His sister, the gray kitten, lay next to him, her breath weak and barely perceptible. The white kitten showed no signs of life. Everything around them was filled with that heavy, grave silence that made his heart beat faster and faster, in panic, in terror. He knew, if they didn't find help, if they stayed here, they would die. Suddenly, into the stillness of the night, a hoarse, weak but desperate cry pierced the air. This wasn't just any cry. It was a scream of fear and pain echoing through the empty yard. The cry was so desperate that even the wind seemed to freeze, as if it too wanted to hear it. The orange kitten rose to his paws, his tiny heart tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he had stopped breathing. It wasn't his cry. It was the cry of his sister, the gray kitten, who had been lying quietly all this time, almost unmoving. Now she arched her tiny body in a convulsion, and from her chest came that desperate, pain-filled sound. It wasn't just an animal's cry. It was a cry of everything she had endured, everything she had kept inside. Fear, despair, pain, all of it merged into one unbearable, fleeting moment. The orange kitten jumped to her, his paws sliding on the dirty floor, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of his chest. He shook her, gently nudging her face with his little nose, but her eyes were dull, lifeless, as if all life in them had died. She didn't move. She couldn't move. But her eyes did open, and he saw a cloudy tear forming in them. The gray kitten tried to say something, but only a weak rustle came from her throat. All she could do was look at him, and her eyes filled with such despair that the orange kitten felt his own heart constrict with pain. At that moment, when it seemed like all strength had left her, when hope had dissipated, when death stood right by their side, the orange kitten rose and desperately howled. He knew he couldn't leave her, couldn't leave his sister, his family. He knew that if he didn't fight, if he didn't do something, their small lives would simply vanish. And then, as if answering his cry, another sound came from the darkness. A quiet, but distinct one. He gritted his teeth, trying to figure out where it was coming from. And there, in the thick blackness, he noticed movement. A shadow appeared in the dark opening of the trash bin. Something stirred. In that instant, he felt his paws come to life again, like a tiny spark of hope igniting in his chest. Maybe someone had heard them. Maybe their salvation was near. He didn't know what kind of creature it was, but he knew one thing. He wasn't alone. His little soul, full of fear and pain, suddenly felt that this cry, this plea for help, hadn't gone unheard. With each step, with every passing moment of waiting, everything around them grew more tense. But something warm, something alive, was moving toward them. And even if this was just one chance in 1,000, The kitten was ready to grab it. This was their only salvation. The dark abyss of night still held them captive, but even in that eerie gloom, a tiny spark of hope flickered. The orange kitten, his paws trembling, was ready to leap toward his sister, but instead, something strange hung in the air, as if by magic, something that didn't belong in this cold, merciless world. At the moment when it seemed that death had forever sealed their unfortunate lives, a figure appeared in the shadows. It was a person. A person whose steps sounded like the steps of salvation. But the kitten didn't know that yet. He could only sense that from the darkness, something alive had emerged, something real, capable of bringing hope back to his sister. And there he stood, tall, his movements cautious, not disturbing the silence of the night. His hand trembled as he gently leaned toward the little cat, exhausted from pain, hunger, and fear. In his eyes there was no fear, only patience and compassion. But the kitten couldn't understand that. He was too frightened to trust anyone. Every moment felt threatening, and even this person's presence reminded him how fragile this world was, how cruel it could be if you trusted it blindly. The kitten, his little sister, lay lifelessly on the cold trash. She was weak, her breath barely audible, and her tiny paws helplessly reaching toward an unknown salvation. She didn't know that this person, who had initially seemed like a stranger, could be their only chance. She didn't see him as a savior. She saw only a silhouette, one that could be as fleeting as all those people who had once abandoned her and her brothers. But the man didn't retreat. He carefully bent down and placed his hand on her tiny body, gently, almost with a prayerful worry, trying not to scare her. The sincerity in his care was so profound that the kitten felt his heart tighten with internal pain. It was astonishing. They still didn't believe that someone could be so attentive to another's suffering. He carefully lifted the kitten into his arms, as gently as he could, trying not to harm her fragile body. She was so delicate, so tender, as if she had lost the last remnants of life. The orange kitten watched as her eyes slowly opened, and in them there appeared a faint spark, not the one that had been hidden behind fear and despair moments ago. In her eyes flickered something alive, something that seemed long lost, faith. The man raised her into his arms, and the kitten, no longer able to stay still and watch, stood on his trembling legs, swaying with exhaustion and fear. He rushed toward him, sliding over the trash, his tiny paws aching. But there was so much determination in them that he forgot about the world around him. All he wanted was to survive. He had a chance. He had a chance to be saved. The man noticed his movement and stopped, bending down to the kitten. He cautiously extended his hand, his voice soft and soothing. "Do you also want to be held?" he said, and his words, though quiet, penetrated deep into the kitten's soul. And in that moment, when the world seemed impossibly vast and terrifying, the kitten felt that salvation was about to reach them. The warmth of the man's hand was not just physical, it was like a promise that he couldn't yet understand, but one that was already beginning to melt the icy chains around his heart. He clung to the man's hand, his paws trembling from hunger and weakness. But this encounter, this hand, this care was the light that illuminated his path. The man gently took both kittens in his arms, and with each step, with each moment of hope, they drew closer to warmth, to salvation, to the home they had dreamed of for so long. But even in this fleeting respite, in the moment when they began moving toward a new life, the kitten knew their journey would not have been possible without that cry that had changed everything. How could he forget? The cry of his sister. Their life, his life, had been saved by that single cry. And now they were walking walking into a future that was just beginning, with a small step toward a better world. And this world was no longer empty and lifeless. This was the beginning of a new life.